At dawn, the plains were silver with frost, and the air felt thin enough to break. Eli Mercer stepped out of his crooked cabin, boots sinking into frozen mud, his breath rising in clouds. The light was soft and uncertain, crawling slow over the horizon as if unsure it wanted to start another day. He stood there for a long time, hands in his coat, staring across the open field where wind danced over brittle weeds. Behind him, his shack leaned like an old drunk, and a mule chewed at a hay bundle too small to fill its belly. He'd once had land, real land, a ranch where the soil breathed with cattle and laughter. But that was before the drought came, before the bank notices, and the coughing that took his wife in one quiet winter. Now it was just him, the wind, and the sound of old wood creaking. Some men, folks said, built fences around their sorrow. Eli was the kind who let it drift with the dust. He didn't talk much anymore. The town saw him once or twice a month, when he came for salt or nails. Clara Hensley, who ran the general store, would always offer him coffee. Sometimes he'd take it. Sometimes he'd just nod and leave. That morning, as the sun burned a faint gold through the fog, Eli walked down toward the creek with his axe. The world smelled like thawing earth. He was cutting deadfall when he saw it, a shape in a mist, large and still. He froze, squinting. Then it moved. A horse? No, a giant of a horse, standing knee-deep in the icy creek, with two foals pressed close against her sides. Her ribs showed through her hide like the bones of an old ship, and a frayed rope hung from her neck. Eli lowered the axe. The mare's eyes met his, dark, deep, trembling. The foals shivered, one stumbling into the water, the other bleating soft as a bird. She looked at him not as an animal, but as a mother on the edge of giving up. He took a slow step forward. "Easy there, girl," he whispered, voice cracking. "I ain't got much, but I reckon I got a roof." The mare didn't move, just watched him, sides heaving. Then, as if she understood, she lifted one heavy hoof from the water and followed him toward the hill. The foals tottered behind her, all legs and confusion. By the time they reached the cabin, night had begun to fall. He pushed open the door, and the mare hesitated, too tall for the frame, too proud for the room. But when a gust of wind howled behind her, she ducked her head and stepped inside. The boards creaked under her weight. The foals followed, wide-eyed. The image would have been strange to anyone. A giant horse standing in a poor man's cabin, her breath fogging the air, the foals trembling by the hearth while Eli threw another log on the fire. But in that moment, he didn't care. The warmth was shared. The silence wasn't empty anymore. By morning, word had already reached town. "That fool Eli Mercer's letting beasts sleep in his bed," said one rancher at the saloon. "Lost his mind, sure as sunrise." Clara just frowned. "Some men just got more heart than sense," she said softly, stacking tins behind the counter. Eli didn't hear the talk, and even if he had, he wouldn't have minded. The horse, he'd started calling her Titan, filled his cabin with the sound of life. When he woke, he could hear the soft rustle of straw, the creak of her shifting weight, the small snorts of the foals. It was like waking up to company after years of ghosts. Days passed, and he learned the rhythm of caring for them. He fed them grain he couldn't afford, broke the ice on their water, patched holes in the walls to keep the wind out. Titan watched him closely, never flinching, as though she saw the pain he never spoke of. Sometimes, when he sat beside the fire, she'd lower her head and rest her nose near his knee. The foals began to grow curious. The smaller one, Ash, would nudge his hand for scratches. The other, Juniper, kept her distance, hiding behind Titan's legs. At night, he'd speak softly, his voice rough and tired. "Lost more than I thought a man could lose," he'd murmur, mostly to himself. "But I ain't never lost the will to try again. Maybe that's what keeps fools like me alive." The fire would crackle, the horse's breath would fog the window, and he'd feel, for the first time in years, something like peace. One afternoon, Clara rode out to deliver supplies. When she stepped inside, she froze. Titan stood by the table, towering, her foals curled near the stove. "Mercy, Eli," she whispered. "You're keeping us stable in your house." He turned, half smiling, half ashamed. They just needed a place that didn't give up on him. Clara's eyes softened. She set down the bag of flour and looked around the small room, the patched walls, the damp floor, the huge creature blinking slowly at her. It wasn't madness she saw. It was tenderness, the kind that costs a man everything but gives him back his soul. After that day, she came by more often, sometimes to bring bread, sometimes for no reason at all. Eli would fix her wagon wheel or carry her supplies. They didn't say much, just quiet gestures, glances that lingered a second too long, a comfort that spoke louder than words. But the rest of town didn't see it that way. Marshal Briggs came by one evening, his coat wet from rain. "You're stirring up talk, Mercer," he said, standing in the doorway. "Folks don't like what they don't understand. They're saying those animals will bring sickness, or worse." Eli nodded slowly, eyes low. "Ain't a skin to town to understand me, Marshal. Just letting the living things live." The marshal studied him, sighed, and rode off. That night, one of the foals took sick. Eli stayed awake by the fire, whispering, feeding it what little mash he had left. Titan paced, her huge body trembling with worry. When the foal went still for a moment, Eli broke. He dropped to his knees, tears cutting through soot on his cheeks. "Don't you leave now, little one," he begged. "Not after all this." The fire hissed in the silence. Then the foal coughed, gasped, and blinked awake. Titan snorted and lowered her head over both of them. By dawn, Eli sat there, back against the wall, Titan's heavy head resting near his shoulder. The light was gold, soft, forgiving. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, not truly. Maybe a man didn't need the world's kindness. Maybe just one creature's trust would do. Spring came slow that year, in puddles and green shoots, in the smell of wet wood and earth waking from sleep. Eli's cabin, once gray and empty, was now surrounded by life. The foals had grown tall enough to reach his shoulders, kicking up dirt and laughter into the wind. Titan, the giant mare, had found her strength again. Her coat shimmered like brushed iron when sunlight struck her side. Eli would watch them graze near the creek and feel a quiet hum inside his chest, something he hadn't felt since before grief hollowed him out. Clara came by more often now. She'd laugh softly when Juniper tried to steal apples from her basket, or when Ash followed Eli, so close it nearly knocked him over. They spoke little, but the silence between them felt warmer each time. Still, the town whispered. "Old Eli's gone soft," said the ranch hands by the saloon. "Keeping beasts like children," someone spat. "Fool's one storm away from losing what little mind he's got left." Eli heard them one afternoon as he traded for nails. He just tipped his hat and walked out. Words didn't bite the same when you'd already been hollowed by worse. But that night, Clara showed up at his door, eyes full of worry. "You shouldn't let their talk sit in your bones," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "They can talk all they want. I reckon folks always fear what reminds them they've lost something tender." Outside, thunder grumbled over the hills. By midnight, the storm hit. The wind roared through the valley, slamming against the cabin until the walls shook. Rain poured through the roof in silver sheets. Lightning flashed across the plains, bright enough to turn night into day. Titan neighed, restless, her eyes rolling white. The foals huddled close, frightened. Eli threw his coat over them, shouting against the storm's howl. "Easy, easy now." Then, with a crack like gunfire, part of the roof gave way. Titan reared, smashing through a beam. The lantern fell and rolled. He snatched it before it hit the straw. "Out!" he cried, wrenching the door open. The wind tore it from his hands. Barefoot in the mud, he led the horses toward the creek. Rain stung like needles. Lightning struck the hills, blinding white. The foals stumbled through the muck, calling for their mother. Titan followed, muscles quivering, breath thick with fear. And then, a sound like the earth breaking. The old bridge over the creek split apart. Logs shattered into the floodwater, sweeping one of the foals beneath. Juniper's thin cry cut through the storm. Titan screamed, lunging into the torrent. Eli threw himself in after her, the cold hitting like knives. "Hold on," he shouted, though no one could hear. He grabbed the foal's halter, pulling, slipping in the current. Titan fought beside him, using her massive body to block the rushing water. Clara appeared through the rain, lantern in hand, shouting something he couldn't make out. She scrambled down the bank, grabbing Eli's arm. Together, they heaved, mud sucking at their boots. For a breathless second, it felt impossible, the water too strong, the darkness too thick. Then Titan moved. With one last push, she forced her shoulder against the wreckage, lifting it just enough. The Foals slid free. Clara pulled it toward the bank. Eli turned back. Titan was still in the current, her body trembling. "Come on, girl," he yelled. "You're almost there." But she didn't move forward. She stood firm, facing the rush of water, as if holding back something only she could see. Another crack of thunder, a flash, and then she was gone, swept beneath the waves. Eli dove after her, but the current tore him away. Clara screamed his name, reaching out. He caught a root, coughing, gasping, and crawled onto the bank. Titan was gone. Only the river's roar remained. By dawn, the storm was over. The air smelled of wet ash and sorrow. Eli sat in the mud, holding Juniper against his chest while Ash pressed close beside them. Clara knelt beside him, her hand finding his. Neither spoke. The light crept slowly across the plains, touching everything the storm had taken and everything it had spared. The unthinkable had happened. Not cruelty, but sacrifice. The great horse had given her life to save her young, and in doing so, she'd saved him too. For days, Eli barely spoke. The cabin was quiet again, too quiet. He fixed the roof, mended fences, tended to the foals with the slow patience of grief. Clara came each evening, bringing bread or silence. Sometimes both. Weeks later, the foals were strong enough to roam. Their coats glowed under the spring sun. The town began to soften, curiosity replacing judgment. Kids came to see the widow's horse babies. Even Marshal Briggs rode by one morning, nodding quietly before tipping his hat and saying, "Good work, Mercer." Eli didn't answer. He just smiled a little, watching the foals play in the grass. He built a small wooden cross near the creek, not for prayer, but remembrance. On it, he carved one word, Titan. Each morning, he'd walk there with a tin cup of water, pour it on the soil, and whisper, "You gave back what I'd forgotten." Clara started joining him. Some days they'd talk about the weather or the foals' mischief. Other days they just stood side by side, their hands brushing. It wasn't a love born of words, but of quiet survival. Two souls rebuilt from the same broken timber. One evening, the sky turned to gold, and the prairie glowed like a sea of light. Eli stood in the pasture, watching Ash, now nearly grown, kneel beside him in the dust. It was a strange gesture, familiar somehow. He knelt too, resting his hand on the young horse's neck. "You remembered her way," he whispered. When he looked up, Clara was by the fence, eyes glistening in the sunset. She smiled, not pity, not sorrow, just warmth. The wind moved through the grass like a hymn. For the first time, Eli didn't feel poor or pitted or forgotten. He felt full, filled by the wild mercy that had found him when he thought nothing ever would. He turned to Clara, voice quiet but steady. "Funny thing about mercy," he said, "it don't always come in the shape of a man. Sometimes it's a creature with mud on her hide and a heart big enough to carry you through your own storm." She stepped closer, her hand finding his, their silhouettes framed by the dying sun. "And if you ever find something that trusts you without a word," he whispered, "hold on to it. 'Cause in this wide and weary land, that's about as close to salvation as a cowboy'll ever get." The camera, if there were one, would linger on that image. The man, the woman, the horses, and the endless prairie bathed in gold. The story ending not with loss, but with the quiet, enduring grace of being found.